officials across this country who have been thrown under the bus in this present season. And it's as if we think that the best way to respond to the urgency is to tear the community apart.
Yeah.
Strip away the community leadership. It's really a very ugly picture.
Well, that's what happened here in Louisville over the whole Breonna Taylor thing. They fired Police Chief Steve Conrad. I tell you, brother, he was involved in the community. He'd come out to community events like that. He one time went to a meeting. Black Lives Matter was there. Steve Conrad went to a meeting and they let him know that Black Lives Matter was going to be there. He said, I don't care. He went. That's how interactive, involved he was in the community. So many leadership that just got thrown under the bus with stuff. And that's exactly what happened to him. He did nothing wrong. Normally what I do with my interviews, I keep them down to about 15, 20 minutes. Good people like you to give us some sort of perspective of what's going on. And one thing that's come up that just nationally and locally is this whole issue of socialism. And I noticed on an Urban Cure roundtable discussion, you and other scholars were talking about that whole issue. And I find that a lot of people, particularly young people, don't understand what they're talking about when they talk about socialism and capitalism. So I know it's a big question, but can you help my listeners gain perspective on what is free enterprise and what is socialism? And as believers, should we be adopting this whole socialist stuff?
I'm sure that many of your listeners are people who are familiar with the book of Acts and remember the spirit of the first church, where people would gather together and bring everything in common. And a lot of people look back at that image and they think, well, that's the way the world ought to be. We oughtn't to have private property. We ought to share it all in common. And we know what happened to Ananias and Sapphira when they held something back and the Lord struck them down. It's a good thing to do from a moral perspective, to want to participate in the community and to share. But it's another thing to say you're going to steal it from somebody to give it to somebody else. Socialism isn't about us willingly sharing in good spirit of Christian charity. Socialism is about somebody else satanically coming into our property and taking it from us, whether we will or no, and spreading it around. I don't know any black people I've ever known who want to be able to have somebody come in and take their stuff away from them any more than anybody else. And that's really the issue of socialism. People say it's about an economic system. It's not an economic system. It's a system of tyranny. Take it from one, give it to another. Whereas the spirit of people acting in good faith, in good Christian faith, and sharing with one another, that requires that they be free to start with. How can you share if it's not yours to give? How can you share if you're not free? You can't. So what they're calling capitalism, they really ought to be calling the morality of freedom. You have to have taxes to pay for things like police, fire, and all the necessary services. But you don't have to have all of life based on government providing things that people can provide better for themselves. I use the example, I tell people, look, we all have to eat every day. And so the government can say this is an essential thing, this is a necessity. But it would be wrong for the government then to say, so we, the government, must make sure that we give everybody a meal, and we provide the food, and we'll run the grocery stores, and we'll run the farms. There's no reason for the government to do what we can much better do for ourselves.
Brother, it's interesting you use that example there about we can do as private individuals better than what the government can do. I used to be, my college days, what you might call a Marxist, so I studied a great deal socialist things. I even worked for a Marxist newspaper up in Manhattan, traveled all around the world. And in Mozambique, Samora Machel is part of Frelimo, it's a Marxist organization. I think it's like after a couple of years after they had taken control in Mozambique, Samora Machel made this very famous comment. He said, government can't sell soap. That's not our role. And I cracked up. He was an ardent Marxist, but he said, we can't sell soap. Not our role.
The practical question isn't that. It just doesn't work. So why pretend it's going to work? That's why school choice has been so important, because the people who built public education seem to think that only government can educate. And the fact of the matter is, making it a public education doesn't change the reality that education takes place in each mind. All education is private in that sense. It's in somebody's mind. And so it doesn't matter whether government schools are where it's taking place or private schools are where it's taking place. All that matters is do you have a society that makes it possible? And school choice is one of the ways that help make it possible, particularly for people who don't have the means themselves to explore a wider range of options.
You talk about school choice. It's interesting. I always see this dichotomy. I teach chess. That's basically my profession. And I deal with a lot of black parents, a lot of single black parents. When you talk to them about school choice, they don't have an issue with it, brother. They just want to get their child the best education possible. And they know every year here, the public school system releases stats that say black children as a whole, particularly black males, are just not achieving as well as they should achieve. And yet, you go talk to a Democratic Party member, including a black Democratic Party member, you say school choice, you think they're talking about us stealing Social Security checks from the elderly. What's going on there? Can you help us get some perspective on that?
Well, I think I can give you one tiny bit of perspective, but let me take you back some 20 years or so when I was in the state of Virginia serving as the state executive director of the Council of Higher Education. People who run the ACT testing service came to my office, and this was their annual trip around the country presenting the next round of testing results. And they come and preview them with all the state leaders. So they came to me to preview the ACT results, and they came in talking about the race gap in the test scores. I looked at them and I said, well, I know that if we look at national assessment of educational progress, among other things, and compare the United States with Japan, Japan comes out higher than the United States. We don't say that because the Japanese students are faring better than particularly white students in North America. It's a racial gap. So why do you describe the difference within North America between whites and blacks as a racial gap? It's not caused by race. So that's the wrong name for it. So I said to them, why don't you call it an achievement gap? So we can then focus on the question, how to improve achievement, rather than focusing on the question of race. And to their credit, they did start calling it an achievement gap. So ever since I had that sit down with across the whole nation, people start using achievement gap. Except there are some people who can't quite get the message and they say racial achievement gap. But the point is, kids can learn. Race has nothing to do with it. The question is, are you giving them an opportunity to learn? If there's an achievement gap, the question is, where is the deficiency in opportunity? And that's where school choice responds, by expanding the opportunity. Obviously, I was raised in the segregated South. I've been all over this country and the world teaching and learning and studying. And the one thing I'm totally convinced of is that there's no such thing as a race gap. All students virtually can learn if you give proper effort to teaching. Abandon them, leave them by the wayside, tuck them away in ghettos or barrios or whatever. Of course they don't learn. They're not being given the opportunity. What explains the achievement gap is the opportunity deficiency. And that's what school choice corrects.
You emphasize opportunity. Could you also connect that with when they talk about the wealth gap between black and white families? Is that related to opportunity too?
Not directly. Abstractly, you can say whoever has $1 million has more opportunity than somebody who has $1,000. Abstractly. Right. But then we forget you can only eat so many string beans. You can only eat so much bacon. There is a necessity, a basic necessity, to allow you to deal on your own with life. And so the wealth gap is not what explains the problem. The problem is, do people have enough to get a foothold that they can build on? That's what's necessary to focus on. And that's where school choice comes in. It adds to the foothold that people can build on. So those of us who were raised from the days of the segregated South always knew when we started out, we were starting out, as it were, with nothing behind our backs, but only the energy of our backs themselves, only what we brought with us. But we weren't deterred. To the 1940s and even into the 50s, we still made significant progress. We did things. We accomplished things. It's only since we fell into the age of victimhood, we've constantly drummed into the heads of youngsters, you can't do anything unless the government and society does it for you. You are a victim. You are helpless. You are impotent. And it's been a drumbeat over and over again. And so who would be surprised that kids become angry and resentful and at a loss what to do with themselves. That's the reality we're facing.
And I'm glad you brought that out with the different generations, because my father talked like you. He talked like you. He was recruited for the Kentucky Commission on Human Rights. They did a lot with getting laws passed against housing discrimination, etc. But he was very much like what my grandmother described him as, a race man, in that he said, you got to create your own opportunity with hard work and applying yourself, etc. Really, more my grandmother's emphasis to me was not Dr. W. Du Bois, but it was Booker T. Washington.
Right.
I'd read about that guy. I was like, man, you crazy. I ain't walking 500 miles to go to school, but, but that was their example. They meant that. That's what we got to do.
Absolutely.
Get an education.
I repeat that all the time. I've written on Booker T. And I say to people, there's been a misunderstanding. Booker T wasn't a separatist. Booker T was a man who believed in self-respect. That's where change begins. If you don't have self-respect, if you don't honor yourself, it's a waste of time asking somebody else to honor you. It's just not going to happen.
Right.
And then that's what Booker T gave by example for us. Yes, I agree with you, your grandparents, that those models that we all live by. And remember, in those days, they say we were not taught our history. Are you kidding? We were all the time dwelling on our history. Carter Woodson was. We loved Mary McLeod Bethune. We knew who Father Divine was. We knew it all. It wasn't that our history was hidden from us. It is that it's been under constant attack since that time, as people try to persuade us that we don't belong here, that we're victims, outsiders, outcasts, and we have to depend on them to take care of us.
And I really see that a lot in that victim mentality in a lot of the Black Studies programs in colleges, universities around the United States. And I talk to Black students who've taken Pan-African Studies degrees or Black Studies degrees. And brother, when you talk to them, they'll talk to you all day about Monroe Trotter and Du Bois and all these others, but they can't tell you anything about A.G. Gaston. They can't tell you anything about Booker T. People who said, hey, I don't care about your obstacles. I'm running through it, running around it. I wandered under it, over it. I'm going straight through it. Made some remarkable achievements. Do you think that there are some people of a political persuasion who almost have a vested interest in Black folks viewing ourselves as victims?
Well, sure. You're not much of a herdsman if you don't have a herd to herd. And if you're a vested interest in being a herdsman, you got to collect a herd. And we see lots of people out there who have a vested interest in collecting herds, and we just happen to be the unfortunate herd. Thus, they keep trying to collect. They say, if you don't vote for me, you ain't Black. That's herd collecting. That's what that's about. Because they see that they want to be herdsmen. And unfortunately, most of these people are people who actually probably wouldn't survive very well in the world if they didn't have that gig. They don't have many other talents to recommend them. But this one they can build on. They can exploit people by making people dependent on them.
We're at the end of our 20 minutes, but before we go, and I probably shouldn't throw this question to you like this, but can you recommend like 2 or 3 books our listeners should pick up immediately?
Well, I'm going to recommend a little known book to your readers, one by a man named Ryan Baumberger. I have it right here. In fact, it's called Not Equal. And the reason I recommend this to people, this young man has a powerful story to tell. And it's a story about the situation with respect to the question of race, but connected with the question of abortion. He was himself an abortion rescue and adopted. And he's built a life and built a foundation, conveying the story of how our community has been under assault with this widespread practice of abortion. How that feeds into the broader narrative of victimization and race isolation. So I'm saying today, this is the book I want people to read. And of course, there are many other books out there, as you very well know. But I think they need to see this first-person story, the way they've seen, for example, Star Parker's first-person story, books about her life. They need to see that this is describing all of our lives. This is not just a scholarly work. My own works, of course, because I've spent over 50 years in academia and normal scholarship, are relatively abstract and then dealing with broad principles and such things. These works are dealing with life, and those are the ones that I want people to pay attention to and read.
I'll talk to my other people, and we're going to make it a point to get that book, read it, review it, and promote it per your recommendation. It comes from you, brother. It's got to be powerful.
I appreciate that.
Brother, I appreciate your time. My guy, he'll edit some parts of this. I just want to let you know we'll get that to you. Give us about a week to do the editing and all.
Feel free to take your time.
We'll let you know when we get it out there, and I guess be in touch with your assistant if whoever would like to have you come back.
Yeah. And send us a link and we'll post it on BCN, Black Community News.
Fantastic. We'll do that.
All right.
All right, brother.
God
Thank
bless
you so
man.
much.